Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The yellowed correspondence arrived at the Virginia Historical Society on a rain-soaked morning in October, delivered by the estate attorneys of the recently deceased Reverend Josiah Pembroke. Among the theological manuscripts and parish records lay a leather portfolio bearing the seal of the Henrico County Medical Board, dated 1829. Dr. Harrison Caldwell, the Society's chief archivist, would later describe the moment he opened that portfolio as the beginning of his most disturbing professional encounter. The documents within spoke of events that had transpired at Ravens Hollow Plantation, a tobacco estate situated along the James River, some 30 miles west of Richmond. The plantation had belonged to the Fairfax family since 1784, when Colonel Jeremiah Fairfax acquired the land through a military grant following his service in the Revolutionary War. By all contemporary accounts, Ravens Hollow had operated as a typical Virginia plantation until the winter of 1827, when circumstances began to shift in ways that would eventually draw the attention of both medical authorities and local clergy. The primary document in the collection was a formal report submitted to the Henrico County Medical Board by Dr. Silas Worthington, a physician who'd been summoned to Ravens Hollow in February of 1828. Dr. Worthington's account, written in the precise hand characteristic of educated men of his era, detailed observations that challenged the boundaries of medical understanding and human behavior. His report began with a routine call to attend to what had been described as an outbreak of peculiar ailments among the plantation's enslaved population. Upon his arrival at Ravens Hollow, Dr. Worthington noted the estate's imposing Georgian architecture, its red brick facade weathered by decades of Virginia winters. The main house stood elevated on a gentle rise, overlooking the tobacco fields that stretched toward the river. Outbuildings dotted the landscape in the typical arrangement of a working plantation: the overseer's quarters, the smokehouse, the slave quarters arranged in neat rows behind the main residence. Nothing in the physical appearance of Ravens Hollow suggested the extraordinary circumstances that Dr. Worthington would soon encounter. The plantation was under the management of Mrs. Constance Fairfax, widow of Colonel Jeremiah Fairfax, who had died of consumption in 1826. Mrs. Fairfax, described in contemporary records as a woman of refined education and considerable intellect, had assumed complete control of the estate's operations following her husband's death. Local society had initially viewed her management with skepticism, as few women of the period undertook such responsibilities independently. However, Ravens Hollow's continued productivity had gradually earned Mrs. Fairfax a reputation for effective, if unconventional, estate management. Dr. Worthington's initial examination of the affected individuals revealed symptoms that defied conventional medical classification. The subjects displayed a peculiar combination of physical deterioration and behavioral alterations that seemed to progress in distinct stages. Early symptoms included a marked reluctance to maintain upright posture, accompanied by an apparent aversion to the use of utensils during meals. As the condition advanced, affected individuals demonstrated an increasing preference for consuming food directly from the ground, often while positioned on hands and knees. The physician's attempts to understand these manifestations led him to conduct extensive interviews with the plantation's overseer, Mr. Thaddeus Blackthorne, and several of the house servants who had maintained closer proximity to Mrs. Fairfax's daily routines. These conversations revealed a pattern of increasingly rigid behavioral expectations that Mrs. Fairfax had implemented throughout the previous year. The specifics of these expectations, as recorded in Dr. Worthington's notes, suggested a systematic approach to what he termed behavioral modification through environmental conditioning. Mrs. Fairfax herself remained largely unavailable during Dr. Worthington's initial visit, citing the demands of estate management and her delicate constitution following her recent bereavement. When the physician finally secured an audience with her, he found a woman of striking composure and articulate speech, who discussed the plantation's operations with remarkable precision and apparent concern for efficiency. Her explanations for the observed conditions among the enslaved population centered on theories of natural hierarchy and the importance of maintaining proper social order through clear behavioral boundaries. The doctor's report noted Mrs. Fairfax's extensive library, which contained numerous volumes on natural philosophy, animal husbandry, and what contemporary scholars termed the science of human nature. Several texts bore extensive marginalia in Mrs. Fairfax's hand, suggesting deep engagement with theories regarding the relationship between environment, behavior, and social organization. These annotations would later prove significant in understanding the philosophical framework that appeared to guide her management practices. As Dr. Worthington concluded his initial assessment, he recognized that the situation at Ravens Hollow required investigation beyond the scope of conventional medical practice. Dr. Worthington's second visit to Ravens Hollow occurred 3 weeks after his initial assessment, prompted by reports from neighboring plantations of similar behavioral anomalies appearing among their own enslaved populations. The physician's journal, discovered among his personal effects following his death in 1847, provided detailed documentation of his extended observations during this return visit. His entries revealed a methodical approach to understanding phenomena that challenged both his medical training and his comprehension of human nature. The February morning of his arrival brought with it a peculiar silence that seemed to permeate the entire estate. Dr. Worthington noted the absence of the typical sounds associated with plantation life. The conversations among workers, the calls of overseers directing daily activities, even the usual animal noises from the barnyard appeared muted. This atmospheric change struck him as significant, though he could not immediately identify its source or meaning. His examination of the affected individuals revealed a progression of the conditions he had previously documented. The subjects now demonstrated an almost complete abandonment of bipedal locomotion during feeding times, moving exclusively on hands and knees when approaching their meals. More disturbing still was their apparent acceptance of this behavior, showing no signs of distress or resistance to what Dr. Worthington recognized as a fundamental alteration of human dignity. The physician's attempts to conduct physical examinations proved challenging, as the affected individuals seemed to have developed an aversion to direct eye contact with authority figures. They maintained their gaze fixed downward, responding to commands through gestures rather than verbal communication. Dr. Worthington noted that their physical health remained relatively stable, suggesting that whatever process was occurring operated primarily on psychological rather than physiological mechanisms. During his extended stay, Dr. Worthington gained access to Mrs. Fairfax's private study, where he discovered a collection of correspondence with various scholars and physicians throughout Virginia and the Carolinas. These letters revealed an extensive network of intellectual exchange focused on theories of behavioral conditioning and social hierarchy. Mrs. Fairfax appeared to be conducting what she termed practical experiments in natural order, drawing inspiration from contemporary European writings on animal training and human psychology. One particular correspondence, dated November 1827, detailed Mrs. Fairfax's observations regarding the relationship between feeding practices and social submission. Her letter to Dr. Reginald Ashworth of the Charleston Medical College described a systematic approach to modifying behavior through the gradual alteration of basic human activities. She theorized that by changing the manner in which individuals consumed food, one could effectively reshape their understanding of their position within social hierarchies. Dr. Worthington's journal entries from this period reflected his growing unease with the philosophical implications of Mrs. Fairfax's methods. He documented her apparent belief that certain individuals possessed an inherent capacity for what she termed adaptive submission, which could be cultivated through careful environmental manipulation. Her approach seemed to combine elements of contemporary animal husbandry techniques with theories derived from European treatises on human nature and social organization. The plantation's daily routines had been restructured around Mrs. Fairfax's experimental protocols. Mealtimes occurred at precisely scheduled intervals, with specific locations designated for different groups within the enslaved population. Dr. Worthington observed that these arrangements appeared to reinforce the behavioral modifications he had previously documented, creating an environment where the altered behaviors became normalized through repetition and social reinforcement. Mrs. Fairfax's personal journals, which Dr. Worthington was permitted to examine, revealed a woman of considerable intellectual sophistication who viewed her activities as contributions to scientific understanding. Her entries demonstrated familiarity with the works of European philosophers and naturalists, particularly those concerned with questions of human nature and social organization. She appeared to see herself as conducting legitimate research into the malleability of human behavior under controlled conditions. The physician's growing concern centered on the apparent irreversibility of the changes he observed. Individuals who had been subjected to Mrs. Fairfax's methods for extended periods showed no inclination to return to previous behavioral patterns, even when removed from the immediate environment of the plantation. This suggested that the modifications operated at a fundamental level of psychological conditioning that resisted conventional therapeutic intervention. Dr. Worthington's final entries from this visit reflected his recognition that the situation at Ravenshollow represented something unprecedented in his medical experience. The systematic nature of the behavioral changes, combined with Mrs. Fairfax's apparent theoretical framework, suggested a deliberate program of human experimentation that challenged contemporary understanding of both medical ethics and human dignity. His decision to document these observations for submission to the medical board represented an acknowledgement that the circumstances at Ravenshollow required intervention beyond his individual capacity to provide. Among the documents preserved in Reverend Pembroke's collection was a handwritten account attributed to Thaddeus Blackthorne, the overseer of Ravenshollow plantation during the period in question. This testament, composed in March of 1828, provided a perspective from within the plantation's daily operations that complemented Dr. Worthington's medical observations. Blackthorne's account, written in the rough but legible hand of a man with limited formal education, offered insights into the gradual implementation of Mrs. Fairfax's experimental protocols. Blackthorne had served as overseer at Ravenshollow since 1823, initially under Colonel Fairfax's direct supervision. His testament described the dramatic transformation of plantation life following Mrs. Fairfax's assumption of complete authority. According to his account, the changes began subtly in the autumn of 1826, shortly after the Colonel's death, with minor modifications to established routines that initially appeared to be simple adjustments to new management. The first alterations involved the reorganization of meal schedules and locations. Mrs. Fairfax had ordered the construction of a series of low wooden platforms in a cleared area behind the slave quarters, explaining to Blackthorne that these structures would improve sanitation and efficiency during feeding times. The platforms stood approximately 6 inches from the ground, with shallow depressions carved into their surfaces to hold food portions. At the time, Blackthorne had accepted this explanation without question, Viewing it as another example of Mrs. Fairfax's attention to practical details, the overseer's testament revealed that Mrs. Fairfax had gradually introduced additional modifications to feeding procedures throughout the winter months. She had eliminated the provision of eating utensils, initially citing concerns about theft and maintenance costs. Blackthorne noted that this change had been accompanied by instructions to ensure that food was prepared in forms that could be consumed without implements, requiring the kitchen staff to modify their cooking methods accordingly. By spring of 1827, Mrs. Fairfax had begun requiring that meals be consumed exclusively on the wooden platforms, with individuals positioned in specific arrangements that she claimed would promote better digestion and social harmony. Blackthorne's account described his growing discomfort with these requirements, particularly as he observed their effects on the behavior and demeanor of the enslaved population. However, his position as overseer depended entirely on Mrs. Fairfax's approval, and he found himself reluctantly implementing increasingly unusual directives. The testament detailed Mrs. Fairfax's frequent presence during mealtimes, during which she would observe the proceedings with what Blackthorne described as scientific detachment. She carried a leather-bound notebook in which she recorded observations about individual responses to the modified feeding procedures. Her notes, according to Blackthorne, included detailed descriptions of posture, eating patterns, and social interactions among the observed subjects. Throughout the summer of 1827, Mrs. Fairfax had introduced what she termed efficiency improvements to the feeding process. These modifications included requirements that individuals maintain specific physical positions while eating, justified through references to anatomical theories about optimal digestion. Blackthorne's testament indicated that he had attempted to question these requirements on several occasions, but Mrs. Fairfax had responded with detailed explanations drawn from medical and philosophical texts that exceeded his ability to comprehend or challenge. The overseer's account revealed his particular distress regarding the effects of these procedures on individuals he had known for years. He described watching people who had previously maintained their dignity and humanity gradually adopt behaviors that seemed to strip away their essential human characteristics. The transformation appeared to occur gradually, with each individual progressing through recognizable stages of behavioral modification that followed predictable patterns. Blackthorne's testament included descriptions of Mrs. Fairfax's extensive correspondence with scholars and physicians throughout the region. He had been responsible for delivering and receiving these letters and had observed the frequency and urgency of these communications. Mrs. Fairfax appeared to be documenting her methods and results for a broader academic audience, treating Ravens Hollow as a laboratory for investigating theories about human behavior and social organization. The overseer's growing moral conflict became evident in his account of the winter months of 1827-1828. He described sleepless nights spent contemplating his role in implementing procedures that he increasingly recognized as fundamentally wrong, yet felt powerless to resist or modify. His economic dependence on his position, combined with Mrs. Fairfax's intellectual authority and social standing, created a situation in which he felt trapped between his conscience and his survival. Blackthorne's testament concluded with his decision to document these events following Dr. Worthington's visits to the plantation. The physician's obvious concern and professional authority had provided Blackthorne with validation for his own moral unease, encouraging him to create a written record of his observations. His account represented an attempt to bear witness to events that he recognized as unprecedented and deeply troubling, even as he acknowledged his own complicity in their implementation. The overseer's perspective provided crucial context for understanding how Mrs. Fairfax's experimental protocols had been implemented within the existing power structures of plantation life, revealing the mechanisms through which systematic dehumanization could be gradually introduced and normalized within an isolated community. The archives of the Virginia Historical Society contained additional correspondence that illuminated the intellectual foundations underlying Mrs. Fairfax's experimental practices at Ravens Hollow. These letters, exchanged between Mrs. Fairfax and prominent scholars throughout the Atlantic region, revealed a sophisticated theoretical framework that drew from contemporary European philosophy, natural science, and emerging theories of human psychology. The correspondence demonstrated that her activities were not the product of isolated eccentricity, but rather represented the practical application of ideas circulating within certain academic circles of the period. Mrs. Fairfax's primary correspondent was Professor Maximilian Rothschild of the University of Edinburgh, a scholar specializing in what was then termed natural philosophy of human behavior. Their exchange, spanning nearly 2 years, provided detailed insights into the theoretical underpinnings of her experimental methods. Professor Rothschild's letters revealed his fascination with Mrs. Fairfax's opportunity to conduct controlled observations of human behavioral modification under conditions that would be impossible to replicate in European academic settings. The correspondence indicated that Mrs. Fairfax had been influenced by the writings of Johann Caspar Lavater, the Swiss physiognomist, whose theories about the relationship between physical characteristics and moral nature had gained considerable attention in educated circles. However, Mrs. Fairfax had extended Lavater's concepts beyond mere observation, developing what she termed environmental physiognomy, the theory that behavioral environments could be manipulated to produce predictable changes in both physical bearing and psychological disposition. Her letters to Professor Rothschild detailed a systematic approach to what she described as the cultivation of natural hierarchies through environmental conditioning. This methodology combined elements of animal training techniques with philosophical theories about the malleability of human nature. Mrs. Fairfax argued that by controlling fundamental aspects of daily existence, particularly those related to food consumption and physical positioning, one could effectively reshape an individual's understanding of their place within social structures. The theoretical framework also drew heavily from the work of French naturalist Georges-Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon, whose writings on animal behavior had suggested that environmental factors could produce lasting changes in species characteristics. Mrs. Fairfax had adapted these concepts to human subjects, proposing that systematic environmental manipulation could produce what she termed adaptive behavioral evolution within individual lifespans rather than across generations. Professor Rothschild's responses revealed his particular interest in Mrs. Fairfax's observations regarding the apparent irreversibility of the behavioral changes she documented. He theorized that her methods might be accessing fundamental psychological mechanisms that operated below the level of conscious resistance, creating modifications that became integrated into the subject's basic sense of identity and appropriate behavior. The correspondence also revealed Mrs. Fairfax's engagement with the emerging field of phrenology, as developed by Franz Joseph Gall and Johann Spurzheim. She had acquired detailed anatomical charts and measurement instruments, which she used to document physical changes that accompanied the behavioral modifications she observed. Her letters described systematic measurements of skull dimensions, facial angles, and postural characteristics, which she believed provided objective evidence of the psychological transformations occurring among her subjects. Mrs. Fairfax's theoretical approach was further influenced by the writings of Scottish philosopher David Hume, particularly his theories regarding the role of habit in shaping human nature. She had developed what she termed accelerated habituation protocols, designed to compress the normal timeline of habit formation through intensive environmental conditioning. Her methods appeared to create artificial circumstances under which new behavioral patterns could become established with unusual rapidity and permanence. The philosophical correspondence revealed Mrs. Fairfax's belief that her work represented a contribution to scientific understanding of human nature that could have broad applications for social organization. She envisioned her methods being adapted for use in prisons, hospitals, and educational institutions, where behavioral modification might serve therapeutic or corrective purposes. Her letters expressed confidence that her research would eventually be recognized as pioneering work in what she termed practical psychology. Professor Rothschild's letters indicated his intention to visit Ravenshollow personally to observe Mrs. Fairfax's methods firsthand. However, subsequent correspondence suggested that this visit had been postponed indefinitely due to what he described as unexpected complications in my academic obligations. The nature of these complications was not specified in the available documents, though later letters hinted at concerns raised by colleagues regarding the ethical implications of the research. The theoretical framework revealed in this correspondence demonstrated that Mrs. Fairfax's activities at Ravenshollow were grounded in sophisticated intellectual foundations that reflected contemporary scientific and philosophical thinking. Her methods represented an attempt to apply emerging theories about human psychology and behavioral conditioning in ways that pushed the boundaries of acceptable experimentation, even by the standards of her era. The correspondence concluded abruptly in February of 1828, coinciding with Dr. Worthington's visits to the plantation, suggesting that external scrutiny may have disrupted the academic network that had previously supported and encouraged Mrs. Fairfax's experimental work. The formal investigation initiated by the Henrico County Medical Board in March of 1828 represented an unprecedented intervention into the private affairs of a Virginia plantation. Dr. Worthington's reports had prompted the board to convene an emergency session, during which members expressed grave concerns about both the medical implications of the observed phenomena and the potential legal ramifications of allowing such practices to continue unchecked. The board's proceedings, meticulously recorded by Secretary Dr. Jeremiah Blackstone, provided detailed documentation of the first official inquiry into Mrs. Fairfax's experimental methods. The investigative committee consisted of 3 prominent physicians: Dr. Worthington himself, Dr. Augustus Fairchild of Richmond, and Dr. Cornelius Hartwell of Williamsburg. Each brought distinct expertise to the inquiry, with Dr. Fairchild specializing in diseases of the mind and Dr. Hartwell possessing extensive experience in legal medicine. Their combined assessment was intended to provide comprehensive evaluation of both the medical and juridical aspects of the situation at Ravenshollow. The committee's initial visit to the plantation occurred on a gray morning in late March, when the Virginia countryside was beginning to show the first tentative signs of spring. Their arrival had been announced in advance, allowing Mrs. Fairfax to prepare for what she apparently viewed as an opportunity to demonstrate the scientific validity of her methods. She had arranged for the committee to observe the daily feeding procedures, which she presented as evidence of successful behavioral modification techniques. Dr. Fairchild's notes from this visit described his profound shock at witnessing the systematic degradation of human dignity that Mrs. Fairfax had implemented. His observations focused particularly on the psychological aspects of the behavioral changes, noting that the affected individuals appeared to have internalized their altered status to such a degree that they showed no signs of distress or resistance to their circumstances. This complete acceptance of dehumanizing conditions struck him as more disturbing than overt signs of suffering would have been. The committee's examination of Mrs. Fairfax's documentation revealed the extent of her systematic approach to behavioral modification. Her records included detailed charts tracking individual progress through various stages of what she termed adaptive conditioning, with measurements and observations recorded with scientific precision. The thoroughness of her documentation suggested a level of premeditation and systematic planning that elevated her activities beyond mere cruelty into the realm of calculated experimentation. Dr. Hartwell's legal analysis focused on the unprecedented nature of Mrs. Fairfax's methods within existing frameworks of property law and human treatment. While the legal status of enslaved individuals provided plantation owners with broad authority over their management, the systematic psychological manipulation documented at Ravenshollow appeared to exceed the boundaries of conventional practice. His assessment noted the absence of legal precedents for addressing such systematic behavioral modification, creating complex jurisdictional questions about appropriate intervention. The committee's interviews with plantation personnel revealed a pattern of gradual normalization that had allowed Mrs. Fairfax's methods to be implemented without significant resistance. House servants, field hands, and even Blackthorne himself had adapted to increasingly unusual requirements through a process of incremental acceptance that had prevented recognition of the overall trajectory of change. This gradual implementation had been crucial to the success of Mrs. Fairfax's experimental protocols. Mrs. Fairfax's presentation to the committee demonstrated her continued belief in the scientific legitimacy of her work. She provided detailed explanations of her theoretical framework, supported by extensive references to contemporary European scholarship and her correspondence with academic authorities. Her presentation revealed a woman of considerable intellectual sophistication who genuinely believed that her methods represented important contributions to scientific understanding of human behavior and social organization. The committee's examination of the affected individuals presented significant challenges, as traditional medical assessment procedures proved inadequate for evaluating the psychological changes that had occurred. The subjects' apparent contentment with their altered circumstances complicated efforts to determine whether their condition represented a form of psychological injury or adaptation. Dr. Fairchild noted that conventional therapeutic approaches seemed unlikely to reverse changes that had become so thoroughly integrated into the subject's sense of identity. Dr. Worthington's follow-up examinations revealed that the behavioral modifications had continued to progress even during the period of official scrutiny. New individuals were showing early signs of the conditioning process, while those who had been subjected to Mrs. Fairfax's methods for extended periods demonstrated increasingly complete transformation of their behavioral patterns. The systematic nature of these changes suggested that Mrs. Fairfax's protocols operated according to predictable principles that could potentially be replicated elsewhere. The committee's final assessment concluded that the situation at Ravenshollow represented a form of systematic psychological manipulation that exceeded the boundaries of acceptable treatment, even within the context of plantation management. However, their recommendations for intervention were complicated by the legal ambiguities surrounding the status of enslaved individuals and the absence of established precedents for addressing such systematic behavioral modification. The medical board's investigation revealed the inadequacy of existing institutional frameworks for addressing the type of systematic psychological experimentation that Mrs. Fairfax had implemented. The committee's report acknowledged that while her methods clearly violated fundamental principles of human dignity, The legal and practical mechanisms for intervention remained unclear, creating a situation in which documented abuse could continue despite official recognition of its problematic nature. The involvement of Reverend Josiah Pembroke in the Ravens Hollow affair began through his pastoral duties in the rural parishes surrounding the plantation. As minister to several congregations in Henrico County, Reverend Pembroke had become aware of disturbing rumors circulating among the local population regarding unusual practices at Mrs. Fairfax's estate. His personal journal, preserved among the documents that eventually reached the Virginia Historical Society, chronicled his growing concern and eventual decision to intervene in what he recognized as a profound moral crisis. Reverend Pembroke's initial knowledge of the situation came through conversations with neighboring plantation owners who had observed changes in the behavior of their own enslaved populations following contact with individuals from Ravens Hollow. These reports described a peculiar form of behavioral contagion, wherein previously normal individuals began adopting the degraded feeding practices and submissive postures that characterize Mrs. Fairfax's experimental subjects. The apparent spread of these behaviors beyond the boundaries of Ravens Hollow itself had created alarm among the local planter community. The Reverend's theological training had provided him with extensive education in moral philosophy and natural law, preparing him to recognize the fundamental violations of human dignity that Mrs. Fairfax's methods represented. His journal entries from April 1828 reflected his struggle to understand how such systematic dehumanization could occur within a Christian community, particularly under the direction of a woman who had previously been regarded as a model of refined education and social responsibility. Reverend Pembroke's first direct encounter with the situation at Ravens Hollow occurred when he was summoned to provide last rites for an elderly individual who had died on the plantation. His description of this visit revealed the profound shock he experienced upon witnessing the behavioral modifications that Mrs. Fairfax had implemented. The Reverend noted that even during the solemn occasion of preparing for burial, the affected individuals maintained the degraded postures and behaviors that had become their normal mode of existence. The theological implications of Mrs. Fairfax's methods troubled Reverend Pembroke deeply, as they appeared to represent a deliberate attempt to strip away the divine spark that he believed distinguished human beings from animals. His journal entries explored the philosophical questions raised by systematic behavioral conditioning, particularly regarding the relationship between free will, human dignity, and moral responsibility. He recognized that Mrs. Fairfax's success in modifying behavior challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and spiritual autonomy. Reverend Pembroke's attempts to engage Mrs. Fairfax in theological discussion revealed her sophisticated understanding of contemporary religious and philosophical debates. She presented her methods as consistent with natural law principles, arguing that social hierarchies reflected divine order and that her techniques simply made manifest the natural relationships that existed between different classes of human beings. Her arguments drew from both scriptural interpretation and contemporary theological scholarship, demonstrating her ability to construct religious justifications for her experimental practices. The Reverend's correspondence with church authorities in Richmond reflected his growing conviction that the situation at Ravens Hollow required ecclesiastical intervention. His letters described Mrs. Fairfax's methods as representing a form of spiritual violence that threatened the fundamental Christian understanding of human dignity and moral agency. However, the Church's response proved disappointing, as denominational leaders expressed reluctance to intervene in what they viewed as matters of private property management. Reverend Pembroke's journal documented his personal crisis of conscience as he grappled with the limitations of his institutional authority to address the systematic abuse he had witnessed. His position as a minister provided him with moral authority, but little practical power to intervene in the operations of a private plantation. This tension between moral obligation and institutional constraint created a profound source of anguish that permeated his writings from this period. The Reverend's attempts to provide spiritual counsel to the affected individuals presented unique challenges, as their behavioral conditioning appeared to have altered their capacity for normal religious expression. His descriptions of attempting to conduct prayer services revealed the extent to which Mrs. Fairfax's methods had disrupted fundamental aspects of human spiritual behavior. The affected individuals seemed unable to maintain the postures and attitudes traditionally associated with worship, suggesting that the psychological modifications had penetrated to the deepest levels of their consciousness. Reverend Pembroke's growing alliance with Dr. Worthington and the medical board represented an attempt to combine moral and scientific authority in addressing the situation at Ravenshollow. His journal entries described their collaborative efforts to document the spiritual and psychological damage caused by Mrs. Fairfax's experimental methods, creating a comprehensive record that could potentially support future intervention efforts. The Reverend's final journal entries regarding Ravenshollow reflected his recognition that the situation represented a fundamental challenge to Christian civilization in Virginia. His documentation of these events represented an attempt to bear witness to what he viewed as unprecedented evil, ensuring that future generations would understand the moral dangers inherent in treating human beings as subjects for systematic behavioral experimentation. The events that led to the ultimate cessation of Mrs. Fairfax's experimental practices began with an unexpected development in late spring of 1828. A fire of unknown origin consumed the main house at Ravenshollow during the early hours of May 15th, destroying not only the physical structure, but also the extensive library and documentation that had formed the intellectual foundation of Mrs. Fairfax's work. The circumstances surrounding this fire would remain a subject of speculation and investigation for years to come, with various theories proposed, but none definitively proven. The fire's aftermath revealed the extent to which Mrs. Fairfax's entire existence had become centered around her experimental activities. Witnesses described her standing among the smoldering ruins, displaying an emotional detachment that seemed almost inhuman as she observed the destruction of years of careful documentation and correspondence. Her reaction suggested that the loss represented more than mere property damage. It appeared to constitute the collapse of her entire intellectual and philosophical framework. In the weeks following the fire, observers noted dramatic changes in Mrs. Fairfax's behavior and demeanor. The composed, articulate woman who had previously defended her methods with sophisticated philosophical arguments became increasingly erratic and withdrawn. Dr. Worthington, who visited the plantation to assess the situation, described her as appearing to have lost the intellectual coherence that had previously characterized her approach to the experimental protocols. The destruction of her documentation seemed to have severed Mrs. Fairfax's connection to the broader academic network that had provided validation for her work. Without the correspondence and theoretical materials that had sustained her belief in the scientific legitimacy of her methods, she appeared unable to maintain the psychological framework that had justified her systematic dehumanization of the enslaved population. The fire had effectively isolated her from the intellectual community that had encouraged and supported her experimental activities. The behavioral changes among the affected individuals at Ravenshollow following the fire presented unexpected complications for those attempting to understand Mrs. Fairfax's methods. Rather than showing signs of recovery or return to previous behavioral patterns, many subjects appeared to experience increased confusion and distress. The systematic conditioning they had undergone seemed to have created dependencies on the structured environment that Mrs. Fairfax had established. leaving them psychologically adrift when that structure began to collapse. Blackthorne's final reports as overseer described the gradual disintegration of plantation operations as Mrs. Fairfax became increasingly unable to maintain the complex protocols she had previously implemented. The feeding platforms fell into disrepair, the scheduled routines became irregular, and the careful documentation that had characterized her approach ceased entirely. The systematic nature of her previous methods gave way to chaotic inconsistency that seemed to compound the psychological damage already inflicted. The neighboring plantation owners, who had previously maintained a cautious distance from the situation at Ravenshollow, began to express more direct concerns as the effects of the fire became apparent. Several individuals who had been subjected to Mrs. Fairfax's conditioning had wandered away from the plantation in their confusion, appearing at neighboring estates in states of severe psychological distress. These incidents forced the local community to confront the broader implications of what had occurred at Ravenshollow. Dr. Worthington's final medical assessments revealed that the fire had created what he termed a therapeutic crisis among the affected population. The sudden disruption of the conditioning environment had not produced recovery, but rather had exposed the depth of the psychological damage that Mrs. Fairfax's methods had inflicted. Many subjects appeared to have lost the capacity for independent decision-making, having become so thoroughly conditioned to external control that they could not function without explicit direction. The legal complications surrounding the plantation's future became increasingly complex as Mrs. Fairfax's mental state continued to deteriorate. Her inability to manage the estate's affairs, combined with the obvious psychological damage among the enslaved population, created unprecedented challenges for local authorities attempting to determine appropriate intervention measures. The absence of legal precedents for addressing such systematic psychological manipulation left officials without clear guidance for resolving the situation. Reverend Pembroke's attempts to provide spiritual counsel during this period revealed the profound spiritual damage that Mrs. Fairfax's methods had inflicted. His journal entries described individuals who seemed to have lost not only their behavioral autonomy, but also their capacity for spiritual expression and religious experience. The systematic dehumanization had apparently disrupted fundamental aspects of human consciousness that extended far beyond mere behavioral patterns. The gradual abandonment of Ravenshollow began in the summer of 1828, as Mrs. Fairfax's inability to maintain the plantation's operations became undeniable. The estate's creditors initiated legal proceedings to recover their investments, while local authorities struggled to address the humanitarian crisis created by the presence of psychologically damaged individuals who required care and supervision that existing institutions were unprepared to provide. The final documented observation of Mrs. Fairfax occurred in August of 1828, when she was seen walking among the ruins of her former home, apparently searching for documents that had been destroyed months earlier. Her behavior suggested a complete disconnection from reality, as if she remained unable to accept the destruction of the intellectual framework that had given meaning to her existence. The final chapter in the Ravenshollow affair unfolded not through dramatic revelation or judicial resolution, but through the gradual erasure of memory that characterized so many uncomfortable truths of the antebellum period. By the winter of 1828, the plantation had been sold to satisfy creditors, its new owners demonstrating little interest in the psychological experiments that had occurred on their newly acquired property. The affected individuals were dispersed among various estates throughout the region, their conditions attributed to unspecified illnesses rather than systematic conditioning. Mrs. Fairfax herself vanished from historical record sometime in the autumn of 1828. Local accounts suggested various possibilities. Some claimed she had been committed to a private asylum in Philadelphia. Others believed she had fled to relatives in Charleston, while still others whispered that she had simply walked into the Virginia wilderness and never returned. The absence of official documentation regarding her fate reflected the broader pattern of institutional silence that surrounded the entire Ravenshollow affair. Dr. Worthington's attempts to publish his findings met with systematic resistance from medical journals throughout the region. Editors expressed concerns about the credibility of his accounts, questioning whether such extreme behavioral modifications could actually be achieved through the methods he described. The scientific community's reluctance to acknowledge the possibility of systematic psychological manipulation effectively suppressed documentation of Mrs. Fairfax's techniques, ensuring that her methods would not be replicated or studied by future researchers. The Henrico County Medical Board's final report on the Ravenshollow investigation was sealed and filed away in county archives, where it remained undisturbed for decades. Board members had concluded that public disclosure of Mrs. Fairfax's methods might inspire similar experiments elsewhere, creating a public safety concern that outweighed the potential benefits of scientific transparency. This decision to suppress their findings reflected the broader institutional preference for maintaining social stability over confronting uncomfortable truths about human nature and social control. Reverend Pembroke's efforts to address the spiritual implications of the Ravenshollow affair through ecclesiastical channels proved equally futile. Church authorities expressed reluctance to acknowledge that such systematic dehumanization could occur within a Christian community, preferring to treat the entire matter as an isolated case of individual moral failure rather than a symptom of broader social problems. The Reverend's detailed documentation was quietly archived, its theological insights deemed too disturbing for general circulation. The affected individuals themselves became living reminders of events that the broader community preferred to forget. Those who had been most severely conditioned never fully recovered their previous behavioral patterns, remaining psychologically damaged in ways that contemporary medicine could neither understand nor treat. Their presence in the community served as an uncomfortable reminder of the human capacity for systematic cruelty, creating social pressure to minimize discussion of their origins and conditions. Blackthorne's testament, along with other eyewitness accounts, gradually disappeared from circulation as participants in the events either died or chose to remain silent about their experiences. The overseer himself relocated to Kentucky shortly after the plantation's sale, apparently seeking to escape association with events that had compromised his professional reputation. His written account survived only because Reverend Pembroke had preserved it among his personal papers, the academic correspondence that had provided intellectual support for Mrs. Fairfax's work ceased abruptly following the fire at Ravenshollow. Professor Rothschild's letters stopped arriving, and subsequent inquiries about his whereabouts revealed that he had taken an extended leave of absence from the University of Edinburgh. Other scholars who had previously engaged with Mrs. Fairfax's theoretical framework quietly distanced themselves from research into behavioral conditioning, apparently recognizing the dangerous implications of such work. The physical remnants of Mrs. Fairfax's experimental apparatus was systematically destroyed by Ravenshollow's new owners, who viewed the feeding platforms and other modifications as unsightly reminders of the plantation's troubled past. The careful elimination of these physical traces reflected a broader desire to erase all evidence of the systematic dehumanization that had occurred on the property, allowing the estate to be reintegrated into normal agricultural operations. Local folklore gradually transformed the Ravenshollow affair into vague stories about a mad woman who had mistreated her slaves, stripping away the systematic and scientific aspects of Mrs. Fairfax's methods. This folkloric transformation served to minimize the disturbing implications of her work, reducing complex questions about human psychology and social control to simple narratives about individual moral failure and divine retribution. The documents preserved by Reverend Pembroke represented the only comprehensive record of the events at Raven's Hollow, surviving through chance rather than institutional preservation. His decision to maintain these materials reflected his belief that future generations needed to understand the human capacity for systematic evil, even when that understanding proved uncomfortable for contemporary society. The ultimate legacy of the Raven's Hollow affair lay not in any lasting institutional changes or scientific advances, but in the demonstration of how completely such events could be erased from collective memory through institutional silence and social pressure. The systematic suppression of documentation ensured that Mrs. Fairfax's methods would remain unknown to future researchers, preventing both replication and understanding of the psychological principles she had discovered and exploited. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.